What most people misunderstand about an empath is that their pain is rarely visible in the beginning. An empath does not break loudly. They do not immediately react when they feel disrespected, ignored, or emotionally drained. Instead, they internalize everything. They observe people carefully. They search for reasons behind behavior. If someone becomes cold, the empath assumes that person is struggling internally. If someone acts distant, the empath leans closer instead of walking away. Their instinct is always understanding before protection. This is what makes an empath different from most people. They naturally absorb emotional energy around them without even realizing it. They notice tension hidden behind smiles, exhaustion hidden behind confidence, and sadness hidden behind silence. Because of this awareness, they often become emotional support systems for everyone around them. People feel safe around empaths because empaths listen deeply, care deeply, and rarely judge anyone harshly. But there is a dangerous side to this gift that most people never notice. The empath slowly begins ignoring their own emotional signals in order to maintain connection with others. Every time a boundary is crossed, they convince themselves it is not worth creating conflict. Every disappointment gets stored internally. Every moment of emotional imbalance quietly builds pressure beneath the surface. And while everyone around them assumes the empath is strong because they remain calm, the truth is that the empath is carrying emotional weight almost constantly. Over time, this creates a silent psychological exhaustion. The empath becomes emotionally overextended because they are always trying to repair, understand, and stabilize relationships. They keep giving chances. They keep communicating clearly. They keep hoping people will eventually reciprocate the same emotional depth they freely offer. But many relationships become one-sided because the empath is doing most of the emotional work alone. What makes this painful is that the empath rarely complains about it. They normalize behavior that should have never been accepted. They start believing endurance is proof of love. They tolerate inconsistency because they fear losing connection more than losing themselves. But eventually something changes internally. The emotional fatigue becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins recognizing patterns instead of excuses. They finally realize they were not being valued for who they truly were, but for how much they were willing to tolerate emotionally. And once that realization settles into the mind of an empath, everything begins to change forever. An empath spends most of their life believing that understanding people will eventually create balance in relationships. They believe patience can heal distance, communication can fix confusion, and emotional consistency can inspire others to grow. Because of this belief, they continue giving chances long after their intuition has already warned them something is wrong. They do not give up on people easily. In fact, an empath often holds on to relationships long after the emotional damage has already begun affecting them internally. What makes this dangerous is that empaths are naturally skilled at seeing the hidden pain inside others. They notice insecurity behind arrogance, sadness behind anger, and fear behind emotional withdrawal. While most people react to behavior directly, the empath reacts to the emotional wound behind the behavior. And because they can see those hidden layers so clearly, they begin excusing actions that should never have been tolerated in the first place. If someone becomes emotionally inconsistent, the empath tells themselves the person is overwhelmed. If someone fails to reciprocate effort, the empath assumes they are struggling internally. If someone repeatedly disappoints them, they search for deeper explanations instead of accepting the obvious truth. Slowly, the empath becomes trapped inside a cycle where they are constantly translating unhealthy behavior into temporary emotional pain. But relationships built on emotional imbalance slowly drain the nervous system. The empath becomes the emotional stabilizer for everyone around them. They carry conversations, repair misunderstandings, absorb tension, and overanalyze every shift in energy. They start anticipating needs before anyone even expresses them. They become hyper-aware of everyone else's emotional state while completely neglecting their own. And this creates silent exhaustion. From the outside, nobody notices the damage because the empath still appears caring and emotionally available. They continue showing up, they continue listening, they continue trying, but internally, something begins wearing down. Their emotional energy becomes depleted from constantly overfunctioning in relationships that were never equally maintained. The painful truth is that the more emotional effort the empath gives, the more others unconsciously reduce theirs. People adapt to the level of access they are given. When there are no clear boundaries, emotional imbalance becomes normalized. The empath keeps carrying more, while others become comfortable carrying less. Eventually, the empath reaches a moment of emotional clarity. They stop asking why people keep hurting them and start asking why they continue tolerating behavior that continuously damages their peace. That realization becomes the beginning of transformation, because once an empath sees the pattern clearly, they can never fully unsee it again. The awakening of an empath never happens all at once. It is not dramatic, it is not loud. Most of the time, nobody around them even notices the exact moment it begins. But internally, something shifts permanently. The empath slowly reaches a point where they can no longer ignore the difference between what they hoped people were and what those people consistently showed themselves to be. For a long time, the empath survives by focusing on potential. They believe people can grow, change, and eventually become emotionally available if given enough patience and understanding. This belief keeps them emotionally attached to situations that continuously drain them. Even when their intuition warns them that something feels wrong, they continue searching for explanations instead of accepting reality directly. But eventually, the mind becomes exhausted from holding contradiction for too long. The empath starts noticing repeated patterns instead of isolated moments. They realize the emotional inconsistency was never temporary. The neglect was never accidental. The imbalance was never something that would magically disappear with more communication or more effort. Suddenly, the emotional fog that once clouded their judgment begins to clear. This realization is painful because the empath understands something difficult for the first time. They were not simply participating in relationships, they were maintaining them. They were carrying emotional weight for both people. They were constantly fixing tension, over-explaining their feelings, stabilizing emotional chaos, and protecting connections that were never equally protected in return. And the hardest truth is realizing they were needed more than they were valued. That awareness changes the empath internally. They stop chasing understanding from people who repeatedly misunderstand them. They stop over-explaining themselves to those who only listen temporarily. The emotional urgency they once carried begins fading away. Conversations that once felt emotionally important suddenly feel repetitive and empty. People around the empath begin sensing the change immediately, even if they cannot explain it. The empath still cares deeply, but something about their energy becomes quieter and more distant. They no longer react emotionally to every inconsistency. They no longer rush to repair every misunderstanding. Their silence becomes intentional instead of emotional exhaustion. What others often mistake as coldness is actually clarity. For the first time, the empath is responding to reality instead of fantasy. They are no longer emotionally attached to who someone could become. They are finally seeing who that person consistently chooses to be through their actions. And once an empath reaches that level of awareness, the illusion disappears forever. Because awakening does not mean the empath stops loving deeply. It means they finally stop abandoning themselves in the process of loving others. When an empath finally begins detaching emotionally, most people misunderstand what they are witnessing. They assume the empath has become cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But emotional detachment in an empath is not emotional numbness. It is emotional exhaustion reaching clarity. After spending years absorbing the emotions, problems, and inconsistencies of others, the empath reaches a point where their mind can no longer survive in constant emotional overextension. For most of their life, the empath exists in a state of deep emotional awareness. They notice every shift in energy, every change in tone, every unspoken tension hiding beneath conversations. They naturally feel responsible for maintaining emotional balance inside relationships. If conflict appears, they try to calm it. If distance appears, they try to repair it. If confusion appears, they overanalyze it until they can create emotional understanding from it. But this level of emotional involvement becomes exhausting over time. The empath slowly realizes they have been carrying emotional responsibility for people who were never carrying the same responsibility for them. They were constantly adjusting themselves to preserve connection while others remained emotionally careless. They were translating mixed signals into hope, inconsistency into temporary struggle, and emotional neglect into misunderstandings. Eventually, the nervous system becomes tired of surviving in emotional chaos. And when the empath reaches their limit, the shift is surprisingly quiet. There is no dramatic explosion, no emotional breakdown. Instead, they become calm. But this calmness is different. It is not the calmness of peace in the beginning. It is the calmness of emotional clarity. The empath stops reacting immediately to every emotional trigger. They stop rushing to explain themselves. They stop trying to rescue conversations from discomfort. Their silence becomes intentional because internally they have already processed more than they are willing to continue discussing. This confuses people deeply because they were used to unlimited emotional access. They were used to the empath always being emotionally available, always understanding, always forgiving, always trying to fix the relationship no matter how unbalanced it became. But now the empath observes more than they react, and that observation creates power. Not power through control or manipulation, but power through restraint. The empath finally understands they do not need to respond to everything they notice. They no longer feel responsible for stabilizing emotional immaturity in others. Their energy becomes protected instead of freely distributed to every emotionally draining situation. What people experience as emotional distance is actually the empath reclaiming internal peace. Because for the first time in a very long time, they are no longer abandoning themselves just to keep other people comfortable emotionally. After emotional detachment, the empath enters a completely different stage of transformation. This is the point where survival turns into self-respect. For most of their life, the empath has been emotionally adapting to everyone around them. They adjusted their behavior to avoid conflict, softened their own needs to preserve connection, and tolerated emotional imbalance because they feared losing people they cared about deeply. But eventually, something inside them changes permanently. The empath becomes tired of constantly abandoning themselves just to maintain relationships that were never equally balanced. This is where boundaries begin to form. At first, boundaries feel uncomfortable to the empath because they spent years believing love meant sacrifice. They believed loyalty meant enduring emotional pain quietly. They believed understanding others was more important than protecting themselves. Because of this mindset, they often ignored their own intuition whenever something felt emotionally unhealthy. But repeated disappointment slowly teaches the empath a painful lesson. Without boundaries, emotional kindness becomes emotional self-destruction. The empath starts noticing patterns much earlier now. They recognize inconsistency quickly. They stop making excuses for behavior that continuously drains their energy. Instead of asking themselves how to fix every relationship, they begin asking whether the relationship deserves access to them at all. That single shift changes their entire life. For the first time, the empath begins filtering people instead of endlessly accommodating them. This does not make the empath cruel. It makes them aware. They no longer tolerate confusion simply because they fear loneliness. They stop over-explaining their feelings to people who repeatedly misunderstand them intentionally. They stop chasing emotional clarity from individuals who continuously create emotional instability. Slowly, the empath realizes that peace is more valuable than emotional chaos disguised as connection. And this realization creates a powerful internal transformation. The empath stops measuring their worth through how much pain they can survive emotionally. They stop proving love through endless patience. Instead, they begin protecting their energy with intention. Their emotional presence becomes selective instead of automatic. Access to their time, emotions, and attention is no longer freely available to everyone. People around them immediately notice the difference. Those who depended on the empath's endless emotional availability begin feeling distance where constant access once existed. But what others interpret as rejection is actually self-preservation. The empath is no longer willing to carry relationships entirely alone. Most importantly, the empath begins reconnecting with themselves. Their identity no longer depends on saving others emotionally. Their value no longer depends on how much they tolerate. They finally understand that healthy love does not require constant emotional suffering. And once an empath reaches that level of self-respect, they never return to the version of themselves that accepted less than they deserved emotionally. What emerges after an empath heals is not weakness, bitterness, or emotional coldness. What emerges is wisdom. This is the final stage of transformation, the moment where the empath finally understands that their sensitivity was never the problem. The real problem was giving unlimited emotional access to people who never respected the depth they carried inside them. For years, the empath believed love meant endless understanding. They believed patience could heal emotional imbalance, and loyalty meant staying no matter how exhausted they became internally. But after enough disappointment, enough emotional betrayal, and enough cycles of self-abandonment, something irreversible happens inside them. They begin choosing themselves. This does not mean the empath stops caring deeply. In fact, they still feel everything intensely. They still notice pain hidden beneath words. They still understand emotions most people never speak about openly. But now their empathy exists alongside awareness. They no longer confuse emotional connection with emotional responsibility. They understand that someone's pain is not an excuse for repeatedly damaging others emotionally. The wiser empath moves differently through life now. They observe people carefully before opening themselves emotionally. They pay attention to consistency instead of promises. They trust actions more than words. And most importantly, they stop ignoring their intuition just to keep relationships alive. This transformation creates a quiet emotional strength that most people cannot fully understand. The empath no longer reacts impulsively when disappointed. They no longer chase closure from emotionally unavailable people. They no longer beg to be understood by those who repeatedly refuse to understand them in the first place. Instead, they become calm, not because they no longer care, but because they finally understand where their emotional energy deserves to go. The wiser empath also stops trying to save everyone. For most of their life, they carried emotional burdens that were never theirs to hold. They tried fixing broken people, stabilizing unhealthy relationships, and healing emotional wounds they did not create. But eventually they realized something painful and freeing at the same time. You cannot heal people who are committed to remaining emotionally irresponsible. And once the empath accepts this truth, their entire life changes. Their relationships become healthier. Their boundaries become stronger. Their peace becomes protected. They stop proving their worth through suffering and finally understand that healthy love should never require the destruction of self-respect. People who once underestimated the empath often become shocked by this new version of them. The empath is no longer emotionally available to manipulation, inconsistency, or one-sided effort. Their kindness still exists, but now it is guided by wisdom instead of emotional overextension. This is the final transformation of the empath. Not becoming colder, not becoming heartless, becoming emotionally free.